Tonight we begin the next chapter, Mark's Court. Mr. Geard woke up before dawn on Easter morning. The outer levels of his consciousness were at once assailed by two annoyances proceeding from opposite directions. The first of these annoyances was connected with Mr. Barter. The teasing memory of Mr. Barter's face, the rankling impression of the man's materialism, the extravagant salary he had been compelled to offer him, the unpleasantness, as if he had touched some sticky and poisonous plant, left in his mind by the fellow's hatred of Philip, all this because something that descended on him like a leaden weight the moment he opened his eyes. The second vexation that rose up in his mind assumed the shape of a letter, with a peer's coronet on it, which he had received by yesterday's afternoon post. This letter was from the Marquis of P, asking him whether he couldn't manage to run over the great nobleman expression himself very casually, and have a bite with me incog. As Markmore Court this very Easter Sunday. Oh, that was a terrible reading of that, but you get the idea. Markmore Court was a small but very ancient farmhouse, which this tower of half the mid-dips kept as a private pleasure house of escape, allowing few of his own family and absolutely none of the conventional people to cross its historic threshold. Save for the crypt beneath St. Mary's ruined chapel in Glastonbury and the foundation of the Roman road between Glastonbury and Street, there is not a fragment of masonry in all Somersetshire older than this little solitary grey farm standing, like Mariana's moated grange, upon a sort of fortified island in the vast expanse of water meadows that followed the movement of the Brew as that river flowed northwest, towards the sea flats of Burnham. Markmore Court could be easily reached from Glastonbury. It was exactly 7 miles away, beyond Mere Heath, beyond Wetherley Level, and beyond the Burnham and Evercreech branch of the Somerset and Dorset Railway. Save for the river and the railway, the only connection between Glastonbury and Markmore was the one winding, grass-grown road, a road that no modern traffic ever disturbed. For although it was just possible for initiates in the rhyme and hatches and weirs of these queer flats to reach by its means a path to Highbridge and thence to Burnham, this particular road lost itself completely in the desolate marshes of Markmore. The old farmhouse called Mark Court, or Markmore Court, was, according to a local tradition unbroken for 1,000 years, the site of a terrible final encounter between Mark, King of Cornwall, and the magician Merlin. This particular tradition declared that Merlin, long after he had disappeared with the original heathen grail into the recesses of Chalice Hill, or into the sea inlets of the Isle of Beardsey, returned once, and once only, to meddle with the normal human affairs. This was when he visited King Mark at Markmore Court, and punished him there for all his misdeeds by reducing him, in the wide, low chamber that runs beneath the heavy stone roof, to a pinch of thin grey dust. With this dust, so the legend ran, Merlin, standing at one of the narrow windows between two stone buttresses, and sprinkling it upon the air, fed the eastward flying herons that came, and indeed they still come, hunting for fish in the ditches of Markmore, from their nests in the beech groves at the foot of Brent Knoll. The grass-grown road, disused for so long between Glastonbury and Markmore, must have witnessed many a strange medieval pilgrimage, and in its long history worse things than that, for it was along the embankments of this road that the Norse Vikings, following the spring floods up the estuaries of the sea, were wont to push the beaks of their pirate ships as they sought for plunder and rape in the fields of the unknown. The hurried and formal invitation to lunch this Easter Sunday at Markmore Court was only one of a series of such invitations that Bloody Johnny had recently received from the Marquis of P. He owed these remarkable summonses to the fact that in his boyhood he had been a servant at the great Elizabeth House in his native Montacute. At this house Henry Zoyland, 10th Marquis of P., had frequently been a guest, and the striking originality, and it must be also confessed, the curious physical magnetism of the young servant had made an indelible impression upon the peer's mind. The Marquis had been reminded of this early infatuation by reading in the Western Gazette of Mr. Geard's unexpected fortune, and as he was attached to Glastonbury, and more than attached to his lonely shooting lodge amid the dikes of Markmore, he had become still further interested in his former friend's career when he heard rumors of him having been elected mayor. Mr. Gurr now set himself to call upon these deeper levels of his consciousness that would be disturbed by these various vexations, whether material or immaterial, that were now besieging so viciously his awkward soul. He turned on his back and stretched out his arm, extending it beneath his sleeping lady's head, while in immediate response to his affectionate movement, the woman, without awakening, nestled down confidently upon his shoulder. With his free hand he jerked up the bedclothes till they were tighter under both their chins, and from this snug security he watched in motionless contemplation the gradual processes of the dawn. The familiar feeling, unlike all other possible sensations, of his wife's gray head resting on his shoulder was soon further accentuated by the woman's turning towards him still more closely in her sleep, so that their bodies came into contact below the sheet that covered them. By giving her shoulder a few little shakes with his left hand, Bloody Johnny now changed the rhythm of her breathing to an easy and silent respiration. His power over his own sensations, when once he was really aroused, was so dominant that although they had slept together for 40 years, he still was able by saying to himself, "This is my woman," to evoke feelings not only of tenderness towards the gray-haired figure he thus held, but even, strange though it may sound, of actual amorousness. If Mr. Wallop, the ex-mayor of Glastonbury, was the most childlike of all the dwellers in this town in his simple zest for the visible world, Mr. Geard, the present mayor, was possessed of a bottomless richness of sensuality that put to shame every frequenter, high and low, who made use of the services of Mother Legg and the attendance of young Toosey in that quarters of the town known as Paradise. Bloody Johnny's rival, Philip Crow, was undeniably fond of his wife Tilly, a woman at least 10 years younger than Megan Geard. But never, for 1 second, for 15 long years, had Philip experienced a single erotic thrill from contact with her. As the light grew stronger, it became obvious to Mr. Geard that this Easter morning was destined to prove cloudy and windy, if not stormy. But this did not prevent him from discovering somehow a scent of primroses upon the air, or even from hearing, and it was almost as if his willpower was so great that he called up this long-tailed gray bird from the orchards beyond the brew, the cry of the cuckoo upon the blowing gusts. A cuckoo? When he had made up his mind that the sun, although quite concealed by wildly driven clouds, must have arisen beyond the Tor and beyond Havyot Gap, Bloody Johnny gently lifted his still unconscious lady from his shoulder and proceeded cautiously and silently to get out of bed. Retiring on tiptoe to his dressing room, which adjoined their bedroom, he shut himself in with his cold bath and his shaving materials. Emerging thence, in about half an hour, he presented to the eye of all observers a figure that might well equal congruity have been described as an undertaker, a head waiter of a congressional minister. His big white face, which, unlike the countenance of Mr. Weatherwax, looked smaller, if anything, than it really was owing to the unnatural size of the back of his great head, showed whiter than ever in the darkness of the Easter morning by reason of the diabolic intensity of his dark eyes. The pupils of Mr. Geard's eyes, like those of the author of Faust, had the power of dilating until they left only a very narrow margin of white. But this white rim, just because it was so reduced, gleamed with an incredible luster as he rolled his eyes. For this was a trick of his, and a trick shared by many prince prelates of the Roman Catholic Church, without moving his head. He now went downstairs, every stair creaking under the heavy weight, and shuffled in his soft carpet slippers into the kitchen. No sign of Sally Jones at present. Well, he could find what he wanted at an Easter morning without any help from any Sally. He did in fact lay his hands upon an uncut loaf of bread. This he conveyed into the dining room, where the family had all their meals, and placing it on the table, now covered with a tablecloth such as one sees in the illustrations of Dickens, he opened the mahogany sideboards and lifted out therefrom a decanter of port wine. Finding no wineglass, indeed no glass of any description, upon the sideboard, Bloody Johnny uttered a growling expletive that sounded like a single syllable much more condemned in polite society than the word damn, and retired into the pantry, from which retreat he presently emerged with the large tumbler. He now stood for a moment in puzzled hesitation. What he muttered under his breath at that second was, "The East. The East. The East." Carrying loaf and decanter and tumbler pressed, altogether, against his stomach, he now sought the small postern of his suburban villa, and drawing a couple of rusty bolts, opened it wide. The East welcomed Mr. Geard with a rush of extremely chilly air, but undeterred by this reception, after listening intently to make sure that Cordelia and Crummy were as fast asleep as their mother, he sank down on his knees in the presence of a little square patch of grass, a few privet bushes, and a tiny round bed with 3 dead hyacinths in it, and in this position began, with a sort of ravenous greed, tearing open the loaf and gobbling great lumps of crumb from the center of it. These mouthfuls he washed down with the repeated gulps of port wine. As he ate and drank, with the cold wind blowing against his white face, his diabolically dark eyes kept roving about that small garden. So queer a figure must he have presented, and with so formidable a stare must he have raked that small enclosure, that a couple of wagtails who were looking for worms in the grass instead of flying off, hopped toward him in hypnotized amazement, while a female chaffinch that had alighted for a second on one of the privet bushes left the bush and joined the 2 wagtails upon the patch of grass. The more greedily Mr. Geard ate the flesh of his master and drank his blood, the nearer and nearer popped these 3 birds. But other small dwellers upon this closed, clouded earth, such as worms and snails and slugs and beetles and wood lice and shrew mice, joined with these feathered creatures to make up the congregation of the heretical Easter Mass. Neither the celebrant himself nor anyone else will ever know. "Christ is risen! Christ is risen!" muttered Bloody Johnny, with his mouth full of the inside of his loaf. "Christ our Passover," he went on, "is sacrificed for us. Let us therefore keep the feast." As he uttered these words, he tossed off his 3rd tumbler of port wine, and then, emptying the remainder of the decanter upon the gravel outside the threshold where he knelt, he struggled up, heavily and awkwardly, upon his feet and closed the garden door. He was only just in time, for the voice of Cordelia was heard from the top of the stairs near his own bedroom. "Is that you, Dad?" "Come down, Cordy, come down, my pet," cried Mr. Geard in reply. But without waiting for her appearance, he hurriedly conveyed the mutilated loaf and the other things into the kitchen and deposited them in the dresser. He was just emerging from the kitchen when Cordelia came running downstairs. She was in her dressing gown and was clearly only just awake. Mr. Garrett, his eyes blazing from one of the deep sockets in his white face, hugged her into his heart. "Christ is risen," he mumbled rapturously as he kissed her again and again, surrounding her, as he did so, with an aura of port wine that was like a purple mist. Cheers.